Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn. I'm Madeleine McAleer, and I'm the CEO of Haven Horizons. And Haven Horizons is a national domestic abuse prevention centre. Our Lunch and Learn Spring series is addressing the lack of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence media reporting guidelines in Ireland, and how this impacts reporting on domestic abuse. It impacts families affected by domestic abuse and domestic homicide, and ultimately shapes public understanding and our policy. So our presenters over the series include journalists, DSGBV activists, academics, professionals, and people with direct experience of domestic abuse and domestic homicide. Today, our planning and communication strategist, Sarah Harte, is in conversation with Luke Hart. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Madeleine, and welcome to Luke. Luke Hart has presented his family story of coercive control and domestic homicide in countless inspiring educational keynote speeches and speaking engagements across more than 20 countries. In 2017, Luke released his book, Remembered Forever, and set up the organisation COCO Awareness to increase the awareness of coercive control. So far, he's trained thousands of professionals in identifying, understanding and ending domestic abuse. Luke is also a White Ribbon Ambassador and a refuge champion, speaking out against male violence towards women and children. He has received several awards for his work in raising awareness, including the Lincolnshire Police Outstanding Contribution to Public Service 2018-2019, BBC Inspirations 2020 Award, and the Big Issues Top 100 Changemakers of 2020. He has also worked with the charity Level Up to produce and advocate for the acceptance of domestic homicide reporting guidelines, which of course is one of the reasons we're here today. So Luke, you've presented your family story to literally thousands of people. What prompted you to share that story?
So I think the main thing was initially incoherent anger, to be honest, because my brother Ryan and myself, we didn't understand what had happened to our family. We were as confused as anyone else. But what shocked us was the responses of people in the community and also in the media. So, for example, there were people who seemed to immediately sympathize with our dad. So people were saying things like, he must have had a hard childhood. It wasn't even a question, it was an insistence that somehow evil is simply sort of caused by trauma, as if there's like a linear chain there. And therefore we should have sympathy on evil, which doesn't make any sense. And it seemed that people empathized with our dad more immediately than with Mum and Charlotte. Just that seemed to be put as a natural response. And it also seemed that many people wanted to almost pretend they had answers rather than genuinely asking questions. And it seemed, I mean, the reaction grated on us, I would say, initially, just the people we were speaking to. And then not long afterwards, the media response was just completely confusing and infuriating, because a lot of it was, again, sympathizing with our dad. So there were terminology like, he was a good man, he was always caring. There was one media report that said it was understandable that he murdered our mum. And a lot of it was just presented through his perspective, as if he was writing it. So there was also the mention of the suicide note he left behind at the scene. And obviously, if you're going to call it a suicide note, you're just looking through his eyes. To Mum and Charlotte, it was a murder note. So all of the reporting and the conversation that we heard was basically looking at it through our dad's eyes. And that framing was just completely wrong. And then I think also I just kind of saw, you know, what you might look at as true crime genre, I suppose, where people just seem to be sort of indulging themselves in tragedy for the sake of enjoyment. Like, people weren't genuinely seeking to learn, to grow. I have no problem sharing my life so people can grow from it. I mean, that's what we've been doing for the last decade. But what I noticed was this really perverse indulgence in people's tragedy for enjoyment and entertainment. And I realized that whatever it was that drove our dad to do what he did wasn't an isolated random thing. It was something much greater, a spirit that was animating many people in society. And I suppose me and Ryan were just angry. Like, whatever that spirit is, we just decided we're furious and we want to do something about it and we want to challenge it. So initially it was a lot of anger, but then I think that kind of transmuted itself over time into wanting to be a voice for Mum and Charlotte. So trying to speak as much as we can from their perspective and to highlight who they were and to use them as an example that other people can learn from, because they were truly wonderful people. And we were incredibly grateful that we knew them and wanted to share them with other people. And then using their legacy, hopefully, to help other people. I think that was a really big thing. And then for me and my brother, even, it was on a personal level, trying to, our life had been decimated, and it was trying to create a purpose so that we could work together and bond and grow together. So it served many purposes, but I'd say it was an organic journey that started off an incoherent rage, and then it sort of hopefully became something healthier over time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, there's about four limbs there. The first was the framing by the community. Then there was the subsequent framing by the media. Then there was your noticing about the true crime genre type idea. So, in other words, people indulging something macabre and very dark rather than seeking to grow. And then there was your own personal journey. Just to bring you back to the start, that your answer. I'd just like to ask you, because when you talk first about the first instantaneous framing by, if you like, people in the community, you mentioned that people instinctively sympathized with your father rather than with Charlotte and Claire. Why do you think that is? Is that indicative of something deeper in society, or what?
I think if I reflect on myself, it's much easier to identify with power than it is weakness, or what you think is weakness, or vulnerability, let's say. It's much easier to identify with power than vulnerability. Because if you identify with whoever seems to have power, it's not, there's nothing to be afraid of. But if you're going to identify with the victims, suddenly you start to realize just how vulnerable you are, actually. And imagining yourself in the position of the victims in that situation is horrific. And it's much easier just to kind of imagine yourself as above it, identify with the oppressor, and then you haven't got to worry about being a victim, have you? So I think empathizing with victims is a place of really raw vulnerability and can be quite scary for people. And it's much easier to think that people deserve it and it wouldn't happen to me and I'm a good person, so this won't happen. We like to rationalize it away or identify with whatever seems to be powerful, because then we don't have to find courage. We don't have to find strength in places where there might be weakness. So I think a lot of it is just people trying to distance themselves, frankly, from what's happened, because
Well,
it's
go on.
scary otherwise. Yeah.
Well, so what you're in essence saying there is that it's almost like a self-protective mechanism, an unconscious one. But
Yeah.
that then leads me to the next thing that you said in your first answer about the media, and the media have a role as professionals in how they choose to cover something. So just wanted to ask you about the Level Up campaign in the UK. It's Level Up obviously is a feminist organisation, and they've introduced domestic homicide media reporting guidelines, which were adopted by the UK press regulators. What caused you to support them, or what was that like?
So I think my brother Ryan and I realized that the role of the media is to help people see reality more clearly, and they aren't doing that. So we were living with domestic abuse every day. It was coercive control. It wasn't violent in the way that we had understood domestic abuse to be. So much of what we'd seen represented in the media and spoken about in the media was, domestic abuse is just really explicit violence. Like, you're not going to miss it when it's happening. But what we suffered wasn't anything like that. And so much of the images that we'd internalized blinded us to what was happening right in front of us. And I think we came to realize that the power of stories, actually, I mean, we're both engineers, so we think very rationally and logically, and stories seem a bit fluffy and fake, or, I mean, I didn't really know how to make sense of stories. Maybe they're just entertainment. But I came to realize that we live in stories, and the stories that we tell shape how we see and live. And the media's role is to help us do that better, and they're not. So helping to produce the guidelines was really important because, as I said, the frame is so key, because two people can look at the same fact and because of their worldview, interpret that fact entirely differently. I mean, we see that all the time now politically, for example. A thing happens and then you just get this widely polarized interpretations of the same fact. And I came to realize that actually what we need to do is to help people see more clearly. And the way that we can do that is hopefully by giving some guide rails that help to orient the perspective. And those guidelines can help be sort of those governing guide rails that help people to look at things in the proper way to understand them. And so as important as guidelines are, I think it helps provide dignity to victims. I think it helps the public understand the issue. I think it's the starting point really, because obviously it's much deeper what needs to be done. But I think the first thing is always aligning people's perspective properly. And I think that's where the guidelines come in.
And that's very interesting. Again, a lot in there, because your first salient point was about the power of stories, and at Haven Horizons, that's something that we very much believe in, the power of stories and knowledge and stories, because obviously they very much change outcomes, can affect outcomes for better, for worse. And then your second point about media guidelines, yeah, they're just a starting point, but definitely I think they're important in terms of, you said, they're like guardrails, you know, to keep the narrative within certain framework. I think you kind of covered this earlier, but you alluded to it. To be more specific, what kind of damage do you think that insensitive media reporting on domestic homicide and domestic abuse can cause?
Well, I think profound, and I never took this seriously, but I've come to realize that ideas have consequences, and really, really profound consequences. So what you believe about reality and yourself and other people shapes how you live. It shapes everything. And if you can make someone believe a lie, you can control them utterly and completely, and they won't even know they're being controlled. So the ability to misrepresent things is so incredibly powerful if you want to manipulate people. And I learned that from domestic abuse itself. So when you're living in it, your perspective is constantly being warped in the abuse to the point where you don't see it, like a fish swimming in water. It's just, you're just blind to what's happening around you. So if the media reports improperly, they are basically like puppeteers manipulating us to see reality in a distorted way, and that's really, really dangerous. But I also know from my own perspective of what happened in our story that our dad actually used previous media reports to justify killing our family. So he'd been researching online other media reports of men who'd done the same thing, reading sympathetic reports, and then using that in his own murder note. So I know that if we report things incorrectly, we can deceive people who are naive and maybe well-intentioned. They just simply are manipulated and deceived. But we also justify those with ill intention. So if people really want to do bad, often all they're trying to do is look for someone or a justification that's going to enable it and enforce it. People often do that. I mean, people seek out justifications. Like if you want to do evil, you have to first justify it to yourself. You can't just do something. You have to first invert your own moral understanding. You have to convince yourself you're a victim and someone else is evil. So when the media reporting sympathizes with perpetrators, it helps them to create their own warped moral perspective. And that warped moral perspective allows them to do evil and feel justified in doing evil.
Yeah, so there's again a lot there. So, you know, at the most fundamental level, as you said, let's call it misreporting or insensitive reporting or inaccurate reporting, is obviously warping public understanding, particularly of those who are maybe not that well informed or maybe perhaps a little naive. But then you're also making the very powerful point, which was relevant in your father's case, that there's a copycat element, and that, yeah. So I want to coach you back at yourself here, which I'm sure happens a lot in these engagements we do. We hope to highlight how, instead of putting women's and children's lives at risk with our words, we can use our words to protect them. Can you you've touched a little bit on that, but can you expand a little bit on that for me?
Yeah, well, again, as an engineer, I never understood the power of stories and words until this happened. And then it became very, very clear to me that words shape reality, and the way that we speak essentially controls how people see and act. And we realized that our dad had to write his murder note to justify to himself what he wanted to do. And we realized the power of media reports in justifying him in doing that. And so I think we realized that actually, if words have the power to cause such evil, then they also have the power for tremendous good. So for my brother Ryan and I, it was a conscious effort to try to use our own words and our own language in a healing way. And that's what we've been trying to do as much as we can, because it's very possible, like I said, to use words to confuse or to clarify. You can use them to break people down or build people up. You can create chaos, or you can help people see patterns. And I think for Ryan and I, it was about how we can start to use that language in a way that's going to bring good to people, rather than the way that our dad had in his life and in the murders used it to bring death.
One of the things that really stood out for me from your story was that you said that you did not understand or recognize coercive control, the million cuts, and also that you didn't recognize that there was a link to the prison you were living in and domestic homicide, and that your father had never been violent until this happened, because he didn't need to be because of his control. Would you say a little? And you saw a poster in the police station when you were waiting, and that's the first time you heard the words.
Yeah, so I had a broken model of danger and violence. So in my head, I always thought that if someone's going to kill, then you would naturally expect increasing levels of violence. You know, maybe they'd push you a bit and they get used to it, then they'd hit you a bit, they get used to it, then they'd, I don't know, hit you with weapons. And I kind of imagined it required a sort of normalization of violence up this ladder. That was how I imagined it in my head. I had no evidence, but that was just kind of what I'd absorbed from somewhere.
It's the myths that we believe, yeah.
That's right. You just sort of think that like you're going to see violence coming a mile off, right? But actually, what I came to realize, going back to the point about languages and beliefs and stories, is that actually violence is latent, and it is latent in a particular worldview. It's latent in a particular story. It's latent in particular beliefs. And that violence, like a dragon asleep in a cave, it can just lay quietly and it can be there for decades. And all it takes is a catalyzing opportunity. It takes a reason to awaken that dragon. But the dragon itself is alive the whole time. Like, but it's just asleep. And what I came to realize is that people's danger is characterized not necessarily by their actions in the immediate term, but by their beliefs, right? And if you understand what someone believes, you know everything about them. So if you understand someone's view of reality, someone's view of humanity, someone's view of life itself, you can determine if that person has a potential for deadly violence or not, simply by asking them questions. And that blew my mind, because I never realized the importance of language and beliefs and stories and words until this happened to me. And then I realized that my dad wasn't a violent man in a stereotypical way, but he was a man who clearly believed dangerous things, who desired control rather than love, who had a warped view of what relationships are, humanity is, and life is. And it was that which contained the latency for violence.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the research says, that the higher risk of domestic homicide is with coercive control, not with physical violence. And that sometimes can be quite confusing for people. And you said as well, when you were sitting in the police station and saw that poster that explained what coercive control was, and then you had to reframe your whole life and your whole childhood, because you realized, and some of the examples you give of not even being able to have an emotional life of your own, you had to mirror your father's and all of those things.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. We had, and I think people do this defensively, we'd interpreted everything positively because we didn't want to believe that our life was a disaster and everything was really difficult and painful. So we often just gave our dad the benefit of the doubt. We reframed everything as positively as we could and saw it all in the best possible light. And then when the murders happened, it was a sense of, not only did that change our present and our future, but it actually changed our past as well. So the very fact that the murders happened rewrote history, because we'd reinterpreted what had happened to us in a certain way, and the murders revealed to us, you had the wrong frame. Like what you thought your life was, what you thought your dad was, what you thought you were was wrong. So in that moment, when the murders happened, it actually reframed our entire past. And then it became this massive unraveling of our entire lives and identity and reality itself, and being like, what's actually true? Like, I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew what life was. I thought, and then suddenly, I mean, this is the thing about believing you're right. It's, you know, you, being wrong and being right feel exactly the same until you realize that you were wrong. Like
Yeah.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
right, I'm
Yeah.
right. And then suddenly the flaw comes out and you're like, oh, I was completely wrong. And what happened to me and Ryan was everything that we believed and thought we knew in a moment was destroyed, and the whole world just became total chaos, a complete incomprehensible total chaos. There was no structure, no order, no meaning to anything, and it genuinely was a profound sense of derealization. Like I felt like in a moment I'd been thrown off the earth into space, as if I was just floating around, or if I was in a story or a film or the Truman Show or something. It's like,
Yeah.
or the
Yeah.
Matrix. It's like you're
Yeah.
just in a reality that's just completely dissociated from what's true. And I think for Ryan and I, we realized that when we saw those posters on Coercive Control, that we'd been looking at everything through the wrong lens. And then when
Yeah.
we put the right lens on, then everything came into focus. And where there was chaos, we could suddenly see patterns, and it was all clear.
Yeah, and this is the thing. This is one of the things. Well, we're coming sort of to the end of the conversation with Luke, but I know that you possibly had one or two questions at the end
Yeah,
that you wanted to ask.
I just want to ask two media-oriented questions, and obviously what Luke has said is incredibly powerful there about framing and reality and lens, and goes to prove the absolute, incredible importance of public awareness raising and public education for everyone, really. But just quickly, Luke, I'd like to ask you, like, obviously we mentioned earlier Levels Up campaign and the media guidelines, which was around 2019, and obviously Charlotte and Claire were murdered in 2016. So in that time frame since then, have you seen, because obviously this is part of the work you do, have you seen an improvement in the media reporting of domestic homicides? Have things improved, or?
So I think me and Ryan have trained journalists, although they are a hard bunch to train. Like it's hard to get the time with them versus other professionals, but for many reasons, I'm sure. But we have managed to train some journalists at BBC and elsewhere. Um, I think people are becoming more aware of the dynamics, and I think that is starting to happen. I think people are seeing it through that different lens, and seeing more of the complexity and the dynamics of what's really going on. I do think the challenge is, though, that people aren't really understanding the causes. Although I do think people are starting to grope at it. We are starting to see people trying to manage understanding healthy relationships and trying to figure out identity, and like people are trying to figure out some of those deeper issues. But I think we're getting there. I just think the problem is that we don't really know what to do about it, But I think the first stage is the awareness and the lens, and I think that's starting to happen. I think, but like we said, that's only the beginning. You have to look at it properly first, and then the journey begins.
So baby steps. I think I'm going to hand you over to Madeline now. Madeline, thanks a lot.
Back to me, and thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Luke. And I should just say, if anyone's interested, Luke and Ryan have written 2 books, and they're in the collection of the 80 books that Haven Horizons has donated to libraries across Ireland, and so you can pick them up in any branch in any library. So just before we go to the questions and answers, I'd just like to remind people that there is no Lunch and Learn next week, and that on the 9th of April we have Professor Susan Leahy, and Susan is the director of the Centre for Crime, Justice and Victim Studies in UL. And Susan's research, along with the rape crisis, has actually been part of creating guidance for print media reporting on sexual violence, using some case studies and court cases. So that's been very useful, that we have had guidelines in the area of sexual violence, and we're looking for similar guidelines now in the area of domestic abuse and coercive control. And so just to say as well that our Lunch and Learn is kindly sponsored by the Shared Islands Civic Society Fund, and any of the ideas, opinions or comments in the events are entirely the responsibility of the presenters or the people asking questions. And as always, the recording will be on our YouTube channel, and you can follow us on our social media platforms if you want to keep up to date with our work or upcoming events. Thank you for watching.